everyone. I am Dr. Madeva Gee, the Executive Director of the Leadership Alliance and Associate Professor of the Practice of Behavioral and Social Sciences at Brown University. And it is my privilege to welcome you to our third installment in a conversation with a doctoral scholar. And in these conversations, we feature alumni who are fulfilling the mission of the Leadership Alliance as leaders and role models, diversifying the research workforce. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Program, a new initiative that Leadership Alliance partners created to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate programs for students from across the country. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank my team, the Executive Office, and my colleagues at Brown University, Chaminade University in Honolulu, Weill Cornell Medical College, and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine for their efforts in creating this new program. So last week, we had a riveting conversation with Professor Robert J. Patterson from Georgetown University on race and racism in America, Paths Forward. So for those of you who were not able to join us last week, I invite you to check out the webinar that's now posted on our Leadership Alliance YouTube channel. And if you also go to our website, theleadershipalliance.org, and click on the Leadership Alliance 2020 virtual program, you will also see videos from previous conversations with doctoral scholars, and that's where you'll find more information about the programs we are doing this summer. But we consider it our privilege to have this opportunity to continue the conversation on race in America from a political perspective. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our doctoral scholar of the evening, Professor Evelyn M. Simien. So Professor Simien is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics Graduate Certificate Program at the University of Connecticut. Her first book, Black Feminist Voices in Politics, examined Black feminist consciousness and its effect on political behavior using national survey data. Her second book, Gender and Lynching, The Politics of Memory, focused on African-American women who suffered racial sexual violence at the hands of lynch mobs in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And her third book, Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes U.S. Politics. This considers whether candidates like Shirley Chisholm in 1972 and Jesse Jackson in 1984, as well as Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in 2008, mobilized voters through emotional appeals while combating stereotypes and providing more inclusive representation. Professor Simien is a nationally recognized teacher and was awarded the 2006 Anna Julia Cooper Teacher of the Year Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, and the 2007 Teaching Promise Award from the American Association of University Professors. She was also recognized as the 2017 Faculty Member of the Year by the Yukon chapter of the NAACP. She teaches both undergraduate and graduate classes, for example, African American politics, Black feminist theory and politics, Black leadership and civil rights, as well as race, gender, and ethnic politics. We're so excited to have Professor Evelyn Simien. And first, we are going to have her provide initial remarks, and then we're going to have our own Dr. Thais Bingham-Hickman, our Associate Director and Resident Doctoral Scholar, to lead us in a conversation. The title of Dr. Simien's presentation is Lynching and the Politics of Mourning George Floyd. Dr. Simien, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to serve. We really appreciate you and look forward to your conversation with Dr. Bingham-Hickman. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to share this evening with you. And so I've been looking forward to this opportunity. In fact, oftentimes I respond to the call to participate as a doctoral scholar and get involved in such conversations with your many students from across the United States and elsewhere. So a couple of things I want to add to my bio as just a point of information is I participated in the Leadership Alliance back in 1995. So I am aging myself there. and I participated at Cornell University. I am a HBCU graduate, so back in '96, I graduated from Xavier University of Louisiana. I am from Lake Charles, Louisiana, born and raised. And I majored in political science at Xavier University, located in New Orleans. And I was a double minor in African American Studies and Mass Communications. And as I said earlier, I participated at Cornell University in the 1995 Leadership Alliance. And back then, we were a small cohort of students who studied the social sciences. So I was asked to share with you all the fact that I was one of only 5 students at the time that represented the social sciences amidst many students that were in the medical health sciences, the traditional kind of STEM fields that we talk about today. So I just thought I might add that with the working assumption that some of you may as well be from the Deep South, the Gulf Coast region, and or might be representing a historically Black university like I was back in the day. I've since matriculated. I've gone from being an assistant professor to an associate professor to a full professor today. So that's a little additional biographical information about who I am. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, but I'm going to talk about George Floyd and this concept of lynching. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a similar Zoom platform meeting, but it was with an institution outside of France. And I was asked to reflect upon George Floyd's murder. And while I've been following the news and the protest, I've heard many news pundits and experts like myself refer to his killing as a lynching. And as a result of having edited a book entitled Gender and Lynching, The Politics of Mourning, I began to think about what occurred on that day, which resulted in George Floyd's death, and the way in which this construct of lynching has particular meaning as we think about it today in June of 2020, given that this is a form of execution that dates back to the late 1800s, the early 1900s. And in the classes that I teach, I often introduce students to none other than anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells Barnett, and this whole concept of lynching as it relates to the murder of Emmett Till. And I often ask that my students think about this concept and what it would look like in real time, and have them sort of map this concept onto a contemporary event. And as I so often remind them when I teach this course, Black Leadership and Civil Rights, there is always some event or several events, unfortunately, that will arise in society that serve to illustrate much of the material we cover in this course, Black Leadership and Civil Rights. So I'm going to talk about lynching. I'm going to offer up a definition, and then I'm going to talk about it as it relates to the events that resulted in the death of George Floyd. And then my understanding is that we'll open it up for some questions. So lynching, by way of a definition, is a form of execution. In my young mind, before I began researching this concept, I had thought the only victims of lynching were African-American men. I thought that it was a singular form of execution that involved a noose and hanging someone from a tree or a telegraph pole. And on account of my research, I've since learned that women, children, families were lynched, and that there was a process of execution that involved oftentimes the dismemberment of the body, sadistic torture, having someone burned alive, that there were massive crowds And this was a form of entertainment. This could be, in fact, someone's date night. This could be a carnival-like atmosphere where you bring the family as if you were going to a fair, a county fair. You would bring your picnic basket. You would bring your small children. And this is something that the crowd would applaud and find entertaining. Oftentimes, coincidentally, this took place on the 4th of July. And again, was a type of celebration that met widespread approval, that was oftentimes advertised in advance to the public via newspaper ads. And so people would drive many miles from out of town to witness what some refer to as a live barbecue. You walked away with souvenirs. So members of the crowd would fight over bits of hair, teeth, flesh, bodily parts. Oftentimes, male victims were tortured in a way in which they were robbed of their manhood, meaning they were castrated. And then in the aftermath, people stood in line for a photo op. And this was a picture that then became a postcard, which was mailed to family members. And there's a very graphic book compiled of these photographs called Without Lynching. So I should probably preface my remarks, it's probably too late now, forgive me, trigger warning, trigger warning, trigger warning. I often have to apologize to my students because it seems like midstream or after the fact, I think of the trigger warning. So lynching is a form of execution. It's carried out by a self-appointed mob that asserts white hegemonic rule, white supremacy, or racist hate for what is otherwise considered a presumed offense, absent a trial by jury of your peers. There is the victim like George Floyd, who is denied due process and equal protection before the law. It is an unlawful killing with no justification or valid reason. In my own work, Gender and Lynching, I describe this ritualistic practice as sexually perverse, a sexually perverse public performance of white male hegemonic masculinity, which today we refer to as toxic masculinity. A ritualistic practice of public emasculation and sadistic torture, celebrated as a spectacular event that enjoyed widespread approval, mass media attention, and what some have called a domestic form of terrorism. Lynching victims were often accused of rape, murder, verbal or physical aggression. They were accused of business competition and having the audacity to exhibit an independence of mind. You've probably heard the phrase sort of stepping out of your place in society. George Floyd stood accused of a crime, a petty theft, more specifically the use of a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase a package of cigarettes. In the case of George Floyd, we continue to witness a public performance of white hegemonic masculinity opposite men in uniform. Rather than Klansmen in a white robe, it is police in their uniform. The act itself of arrest that is responding to a complaint, a 911 phone call, and taking an African-American male into police custody has become habitual, ritualistic. Like stop and frisk can take the form of public humiliation or emasculation. George Floyd, if you remember, if you've seen the video that has since gone viral, was put in handcuffs and positioned face down. While not celebrated by onlookers, but harshly criticized by those on-site witnesses who took live footage that has since gone viral on the internet, the fact remains that George Floyd's death constitutes a spectacular event that grips the public's attention as he cries out for his mother. And we witness his slow death that is nothing short of torture as he proclaims, "I can't breathe. The officer's knee is used to apply excessive deadly force that is consistent with strangulation or choking that similarly could have been achieved through the use of a noose. The term lynching, like the phrase police shooting, evokes an image derived from this collective memory which both African-American men and women share, but to which only African-American men claim full-blown entitlement. For the most part, historians who write about lynching address the practice as it occurred ritualistically in the Deep South and targeted African-American men. Similarly, the press coverage of police shootings addresses this practice as it too often occurs ritualistically and results in the death of African-American men disproportionately. That is not to suggest African-American women are not similar victims of lynching or police shootings or deadly force in the custody of police, but of the hundreds of Black men who have died at the hands of law enforcement, George Floyd's death, like Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, and Michael Brown, stand out. While African-American women have died in police custody, they have done so without explosively emerging as some of the most gripping examples of anti-Black violence, with notable exceptions being Breonna Taylor in Kentucky and Sandra Bland in Texas. All things considered, George Floyd was taken into police custody for a presumed offense. He too was denied a trial by jury and subject to execution, that is an unlawful killing without just cause. So the question I pose, and it's a rhetorical one, can we honestly divorce the murder of George Floyd from the history of anti-Black violence, that being in this case, lynching in the United States, and reduce it to second-degree murder? The subsequent mourning demands our recognition. Otherwise, private grief has gone public. Whether the American consciousness has been merely pricked or whether there has been what we call a public reckoning or a seismic shift in the American consciousness remains to be seen, while it continues to be debated by news pundits and experts in the field. I do believe that we are witnessing active democratic citizenry demand collective responsibility for protecting Black lives that matter. And I suspect we can expect to see more to come this November, that is during the 2020 American presidential election. The mass protests that have followed and the related press coverage exposes the otherwise hidden transcripts via the police officer's body cam, the bystanders' cell phones, and security videos from local businesses in the area, all of which have gone viral over the internet and we've probably viewed time and time again. As a result, we have all become increasingly susceptible to what some may call voyeurism in the process. For example, yet another police shooting, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, occurred last Friday night in a Wendy's parking lot, and the police chief has since resigned in Atlanta. In the aftermath of massive protests and the funeral of George Floyd, this recent incident overshadows the federal anti-lynching legislation that is working its way through the United States House and Senate. More recently, the passage of Breonna's law, which imposes limits on no-knock warrants in Kentucky. And a generation of young activists like yourselves, Black and white, who continue to speak out, and that direct act itself, the act of speaking out, has since served to reinforce the protest on the ground and inspired countless public pronouncements, as you might have already witnessed. The signs and billboards that read, "White silence is violence," as well as the mayor of DC's effort to have Black Lives Matter painted in giant yellow letters on the road to the White House. And while these events and subsequent actions should not be taken lightly, even as critics have reduced them to symbolic gestures, I think there is still hope and some optimism to be gleaned from these very symbolic acts. And so I will stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Simien. I really appreciate the way that you've been able to relate the current events to give us some historical context, because I feel like, growing up, the history isn't taught. And so I think it's really powerful for people to understand and draw that connection to the events that have happened in the past to what's happening today. So I really appreciate that, that parallel, because, sometimes it's so far in the back of our minds, but we have to remember that it wasn't that long ago. And, I think that allowing people to kind of reflect upon that builds greater understanding. So thank you for that. And we have a number of questions, I think, and one came in through the chat that I really think that we should explore, which has to do with some of the things that you were just discussing with us. So one of the questions that came in from the students is, do you think that the public display of death of minorities is important to instill fear and mentally enslave the minority by the majority? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a deep question, because one concern as a parent with a young boy who's 10 years old is, in the back of my mind, I do wonder what impact such images have, as he's got this young mind that's still developing. As a parent, I can speak to similarly living with a degree of fear, of unknown, in the event that my son could be pulled over, could be subject to an unlawful arrest. And so I think the fear is very real for Black and brown people in this country. Anytime we're followed by the police, much less pulled over by the police, there's a degree of anxiety that comes over myself when I just see a police car. It doesn't have to follow me. It could just be parked. And sort of my spidey senses go up, right? And let me check my speedometer and make sure I'm not speeding, and I proceed to slow down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have the same anxiety, just driving on the highway. Anytime I pass a police car, I'm always, just cautious, and that anxiety just kind of rolls over me. And we were actually just talking about this. We had a town hall last week with some of our students, and I think that I can also relate to the fact that, having a young son, I have a 5-year-old, and I try not to let him watch the news, but how these things are going to impact him, and how I'm going to have that tough conversation eventually with him. I think that's a burden that, minorities bear, that it kind of goes unspoken and we just kind of deal with. And although, these events have been tragic, I really think that it's allowing some of us to open up and articulate those anxieties and concerns as well. So we have another student question, and this one is specific to Black women. So with your work on race, especially with your book on Black women and the racial sexual violence they faced in America, how do you stop yourself from internalizing these issues when you're dealing with such heavy but yet extremely important topics like this one?
I thought about this question in advance, because it's a question I've asked other people who write on genocide and similar difficult topics. And for me, there's a sense of agency on my part that I feel when exposing these stories, these narratives that otherwise would go unwritten and unknown. And so I was very purposeful when it came to writing the introduction to the edited volume, Gender and Lynching, and it resulted from me attending a talk by Leon Litwack, because he's a historian, prior to his talk, he wrote this book called Trouble on My Mind that I think won several awards. And it struck me after his talk that I had not known that women and children were also victims of lynching. And this talk was given at Harvard University. I was participating in a month-long sort of research seminar for instructors who teach on the civil rights movement. There were 20 of us that were handpicked, and we were charged with the task of thinking about how we might produce a publication at the end of this month-long research seminar. And the outcome of my participation was this edited volume. And Leon Lichtwak was a speaker during, I think, the first week of the program. And immediately I formed a working group called Gender and Lynching. And the end result was this edited book that was later published. And the participants that attended this workshop, this research month-long program with me, helped vet the essays and contributed to the volume. And we subsequently presented at a conference on a panel by the same title, Gender and Lynching. And it was standing room. There were people sitting on the floor. There were people standing up the back. And for me, the driver has been this compulsion to shed light on otherwise difficult aspects of history. So not to live with a sanitized version that I feel is less than honest about real world events that continue to haunt us today. So it's out of a sense of kind of duty. And honestly, I'm so captivated and intrigued by the stories that I get drawn in. And I love to write about my subjects in a very honest and heart-wrenching way. And that's how I can explain it best for myself. In some ways, I feel it's cathartic to write about and talk about these subjects, no matter how difficult they are.
Yeah, and kind of building upon that point, you know, you've expressed how you articulate, you know, how you internalize that. What would you say to teachers, you know, in terms of educating our students? And so one of the questions that has come up several times is, how can we give future generations a better, well-rounded education that shows a historical perspective of the inequities that folks face and highlight the importance of equality? What would you say to the educators, and how can we incorporate this into enriching our students?
Obviously, I think we've got to revise the curriculum, and the teachers themselves in their training have to be better educated with regard to the history. And I think it's on the educational system to expand the curriculum to include Africana studies, Latino studies. I mean, to think about the rich diversity of this nation and incorporate that in the curriculum. But obviously you've got to train the teachers before they enter the classrooms. And it means tooling up. Mm-hmm. I mean, many of us, because of COVID-19, we've had to equip ourselves with new tools when it comes to technology.
Right.
These online platforms. For many of us who may have been, you know, really handicapped with regard to technology. Mm-hmm. You can make a similar argument, you know, for teacher training, you know, and the onus is on one, the teachers, but also the system to go through a facelift and do the hard work, but you've got to have the right people in place to sort of have the honest conversation and to truly transform the curriculum as we know it.
Right. And I think that that actually brings up another question that I asked one of the other doctoral scholars, Dr. Castellanos, is, you know, what does the term activist scholar mean to you, and how do you practice activism, and how would you recommend that our community practice activism in their field?
I have been asked this question many times at different junctures in my career. And from the moment I was an untenured faculty member to present, and the answer has changed. It has evolved as a result of my role. So as a untenured junior faculty member, I was on a platform that also is available in YouTube, and it was talking about Black women in the ivory tower, and answering this question. I was for years a big sister in Big Brothers Big Sisters program as an untenured faculty member. And I did a lot of community service while I was also trying to publish and get promoted to associate. It wasn't maybe the recommendation I would have made for other people that were junior, but I was able to strike the balance and obviously still publish and get promoted. But in some ways, our very existence has such meaning and impact. The fact that you exist as a Black woman with a PhD in any discipline, I don't care what it is, you know, for you to just exist on that campus has meaning and impact. I would say certainly you can't just teach and go home. Students need you to be present and available, and that is the tax, the burden that we bear. But I don't know where to even begin with that question, because to write on the subjects that I do, to publish as I do, is an act that has great impact in my discipline. To write about Black women in politics at a time when intersectionality was not sexy or attractive, to write a dissertation on Black women, I was told I wasn't going to get a job. And then I landed a tenure track job at a major R1 institution. And I continued to do what I was told, which was publish with a major university press, have a major university press book and several articles when you go up for promotion. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a political act in that I'm not in the streets, you know, protesting, but you need us in you need us in the street, you need us in the courtroom, you need us in the halls of Congress, you need us in academia, you need us in the classrooms, you need us in the medical health field. We are just so grossly underrepresented that if you are in a position to get a 4-year degree and then go on, you owe it to your community, you owe it to your family, you owe it to that race for whom you represent to make it happen.
Yeah.
That urgent that we assume these roles and these positions in all walks of life. Even as they say the police need to not answer every call, like you need well, guess what? The social workers are predominantly white and female, and they don't get it either. So we need to be social workers. You know, if we want society to change, we talk about, you know, reforming the police department and redirecting these calls to mental health professionals. Well, there aren't enough mental health professionals, and there's certainly not enough of them that are people of color that will also be culturally competent.
Yeah, I think that's so important to hear you say that. This question actually, or comment, came up during our town hall where a student was basically like, you know, I want to get involved, but I don't necessarily want to go out and protest. do I still have a role? And I think everything that you just articulated is spot on, which is, be active in your field and find ways to help your community in whatever discipline or direction you're going in. You don't necessarily have to be out on the streets protesting. I think that's such an important point for people to hear. So speaking of politics, I know you mentioned that, and there's been quite a few questions that have come up on your published work. And this was a question that came from one of our students. The question or comment is, I read your paper titled The Cult of First Womanhood, where you talk about race gendering in American politics. Given that currently the VP candidacy for the Democratic Party for the 2020 election is being heavily scrutinized, how do you think the search for ideal white womanhood will translate onto this campaign trail? Do you think that tokenism is something we should be aware of as well in this scenario?
Oh my God, that's a multi-layered, that's a complicated question. Okay, Biden has already made the promise that his VP pick will be a woman. And there is increasing pressure on him for that pick to be a Black woman, an African-American woman. And we know sort of this preliminary list of white and Black women who have been vetted for his pick. Anytime we're talking about politics, you have to be wary of tokenism, period. Whether it's the local mayor, the governor, the senator, much less the VP or the president of the United States. Tokenism is and has always been sort of a problem. And so, it will be interesting to see who that chosen candidate will be and what their record, what their story will be in terms of their background, right? Whether it will be Val Demings from Florida, who has a background in law enforcement, policing, given the current trend in terms of police reform and the police shootings that are ongoing these days, and her representing a swing state like Florida. It's definitely a political choice. And as people of color who have often been taken for granted, who vote and typically outvote or perform other racial groups, particularly African-American women outvote all other race, sex groups when it comes to the American presidential election. There is demands they're putting upon this office to be represented. And so the who is a big question. And you've always got to be concerned with tokenism and whether or not that individual will be true to the interest of the community for which they represent.
Thank you for that. And kind of building upon that, just in terms of the current movement that we're seeing, we've had a few students ask this question, which is, how has Black feminism influenced the Black Lives Matter movement today? Asked another way, how do you feel that we can modify activism so that we do not neglect Black women?
You've probably heard this word, intersectional feminism, intersectionality. The movement has to learn from the mistakes of second wave feminism, that is with respect to agenda items that make it on a very long list of demands in terms of goods and services, what we call bread and butter issues that disproportionately impact the lives of those that have lower incomes, lower levels of education, lack access to healthcare and medical services, all of which has come to the fore during COVID-19. People with pre-existing conditions, people that are the most vulnerable because they're working as frontline workers who are essential employees in the poultry factories, in the grocery stores, as the transit bus drivers, and the list goes on. These are people that do not have a safety net or a level of privilege to kind of work from home and Zoom in to their meetings, yet have to report to work for not a living wage, but a minimum wage, and oftentimes absent healthcare coverage because there is no universal healthcare system in the United States. And so these are sort of the concerns that have to be brought to the fore that disproportionately impact the lives of women and should go hand in hand with a feminist movement that represents the concerns of all women, not just those that are in a position to be HP CEO, you know, or some other executive for any one of these social media giants. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because I feel like there, at least from an onlooker's perspective, there was a lot more involvement in the Me Too movement from women, whereas now I don't see as much. I mean, I'm seeing it from the, you know, in the minority community, but I think, as you mentioned, this current crisis that we're facing impacts society as a whole. So, you know, the more that we band together, as an example, you know, you brought up the COVID-19 situation, and people don't realize that, you know, when minorities get sick and overwhelm the healthcare system, that's their healthcare system too. And so I feel like there, you know, people need to come together and kind of support the cause, and you know, I feel that it's happening more so now than in the past. Like there's been an awakening, and I'm just curious on your thoughts on that. Like I've heard people say it, I've watched, you know, news outlets kind of say that, and articles written about that in terms of, is this actually a tipping point? Do you see it that way? And what would you say was the trigger, if you will?
Well, I want to reflect on something you said with regard to feminism. Feminism cannot and should not be limited to an abortion debate and having equal access to abortion. It's a much longer list of agenda items that speak to sort of the, I don't know, 62 cents that African-American women make compared to a white man's dollar. You know, there's some real socioeconomic issues at play. And so feminism should not be reduced to an access to abortion debate, but viewed as a more all-encompassing sort of movement that intersects with race and class and ethnic identity, as well as the LGBTQ community, because these are interlocking systems of oppression. And so it cannot be an either or cause, but there's gotta be some intersectional understanding of the movement as having mutually reinforcing goals that impact a group of people that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, while at the same time they've been marginalized and othered on account of an axis or more of identities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, one question just came up that I think I can relate to as someone who was in the STEM discipline. You know, I don't feel like I've had a lot of exposure, at least in my academic training, to social and political sciences. So one of the questions that has come up is, as one of the few social science students among many traditional STEM students during your Leadership Alliance summer, do you think then and now STEM students do not have enough exposure to social and political sciences? Is it possible that this is the reason for bias in healthcare practitioners? If it is, how do we address it from a systemic point of view?
That's an interesting question, because when we were five, the five of us stuck together. And there wasn't a whole lot of interaction between the five of us who were in the social sciences and the STEM folk. It was like two different worlds. It was like two separate programs. There was the five of us that hung together like besties. You know, we were together, the five of us. And we weren't even all together sure what the STEM folks were doing. It felt like it was 50 of them and 5 of us. Mm-hmm. We could have been like the 5 musketeers. And then it was like, I don't know what they do. I don't know how they spend their day. But then we come together for this this big conference and maybe a big uniform meeting. But I went to a STEM school. Yeah. This is the most African-American doctors that touts itself for producing the most Black pharmacists, medical doctors, and Black people that study physics. So I went to a solid STEM school. My roommate was pre-med. She's a doctor. Everybody was pre-med on that campus. Outlier there. You know, everybody walking around biology pre-med, chemistry pre-med. You know, Xavier has this reputation of being a solidly STEM school. Though, now I can say in that environment, those students were very conscious of the social sciences and had a real appreciation for what I was doing, even though I took the baby biology, you know, I took a different kind of biology than they were still in my Intro to African American Studies courses, because Intro to AFAM was a required gen ed for graduation at the time I was there. And so I don't know if that's because it was a historically Black college and university, but I do feel like my peers in that environment were, as the young people say, woke and conscious. But that's a majority Black, and now it's a majority Black and Asian school. And the pharmacy school, because there's only 2 pharmacy schools in the state of Louisiana, the pharmacy school was actually majority white. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about the medical field and bedside manner, the real issue is making, I think, those white doctors culturally competent and equipping them with a certain degree of knowledge of our communities. And understanding what are some of those socioeconomic factors that may explain why we have these pre-existing conditions, and what's the impact of racism as a stressor, a chronic stressor that shortens our life expectancy and has this aging and weathering effect. That's important to understand.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we can do a better job at getting those 2, you know, disciplines together, at least within our organization. I know that, you know, we try to bring students together, as an example, in a format like this, where we have students from all disciplines, but I feel like there is work to be done, and we could probably do more to allow those students to engage with one another and learn from each other. For students that may not have had that experience that you had, where, you know, they have to actually take courses and learn about it. So thank you for that. That will be something that I take away and hopefully can do something about.
I would add at UConn, we have an Africana Studies major and minor, and we do get students from the medical health field, like public health, that are minoring in Africana Studies.
Mm-hmm.
Do get sort of a cohort of students from the sciences that pick up Africana Studies as a minor.
So kind of shifting gears a little bit, we had another question come in from a student who asked, if you had to advise a woman preparing to start a political career, what would you say to her?
When they say political, they mean the word like running for office. When you say political career, are we talking about running for elective office or?
I believe so, yeah, I believe so.
Oh my God. I have two mindsets. It's like, here's what the literature says, like that they have to do, because there's some politics. You know, there's a lot of testimonies from African-American women who currently serve in public office that say in order to get elected, had to kind of change their look and appearance to gain votes. So it means straightening their hair versus wearing it braided or natural.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this research within political science that has involved interviews with Black women who currently hold public office. And what women are saying is there's sort of a politics of appearance when they're canvassing and knocking on doors and having to sort of change themselves physically as far as the hairstyle and look goes. And then once elected, changing their look and appearance to be more true to self.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sit well with me. Hearing that does not sit well with me. And the world of politics is, just from the outside looking in as any onlooker, you know, it's pretty nasty. You know, you have to be able to raise millions of dollars in order to run a successful campaign.
Mm-hmm.
We are typically elected from majority minority districts versus majority white districts. And I would say you have to start by working campaigns at a young age, sort of apprenticing, you know, and working campaigns and getting the support or the nod, the endorsement. When I think about Black women that are currently serving in Congress that have recently been elected as historic first,
Mm-hmm.
they were well connected within the context of the Democratic Party. And they started working campaigns. So the squad,
Yeah.
it's Ayanna Pressley, Johanna Hayes from Connecticut, or Omar from Minnesota. These are women who at a very young age were attending rallies. I mean, Omar attended rallies with her grandfather. These are women who got involved as young people, and especially during the college years, in terms of grassroots organizing and campaigning.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I'm seeing more and more women of color in politics today, like you mentioned, you know, Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you have Mayor Bowser, you have Mayor Lightfoot from Chicago. So I was going to ask you, what do you think has changed, you know, given that we're seeing that now?
For years now, African-American women have always been highly participatory in terms of exercising their right to vote and in other ways contributing to campaigns, but not running for elective office. And so now we're seeing a turning point of not only are they working campaigns, not only are they exercising their right to vote, but now they're running for elective office in a very timely fashion. And perhaps there's a role modeling effect as you see a Kamala Harris, as you see other Black women gain traction in the electoral arena, whether it's Stacey Abrams, who comes so close, and had it not been for voter suppression, probably would have been the first Black woman governor of a southern state, Georgia, right? And so now is the time to actually move that needle when you've got more progressive people, younger people that are going to the polls and casting ballots.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing, I've never seen this in politics, at least in my adult experience. So
it's impressive. I mean, to sit back and see all these mayors in light of this pandemic, you know, Lightfoot in Chicago, London Breed in San Francisco, the mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And even the mayor in Minneapolis, African-American male, and then your attorney general in Minnesota as well. Now, they are all historic first, by the way. I have an edited book. So there's this book out, right, that you read a chapter, but I'm currently working on an edited volume that profiles these individuals. So that's why I'm able to like roll it out, because I just read the Presley chapter about a week ago. I just read the Gilliam chapter a week ago. And so I'm currently working on an edited book on these historic cases. The Omar chapter was done back in May. And so this is front and center for me because I have a chapter on London Breed that's coming.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it, yeah.
That's why I can speak to these cases.
Yeah, I'm
interested.
We are all interested, and I know we're running out of time here, but yeah, we'd love to hear from you when you publish that. Feel free to reach out, and we will let our community know. So with that, there is one last question, which is specific to books. What books or authors would you recommend so that folks can get historical context on some of these events that you talked about, and even some of the current events? Do you have any recommendations?
Oh my God.
If you don't know off the top of your head and you want to send them to us later, we're happy to share it later. But if there's any that come to mind, please.
I will table that and get you a list, because I just don't want to, off the cuff, throw some things out there. I want to give that my due diligence. I want to give that a little more thought, and I can give you a list of some books. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Simien. This conversation has been great. We really appreciate your time, and I know our students and our community appreciate it. We've had lots of questions come in, so we will be following up with additional questions that we did not get to today, but we really just want to thank you, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you at the next event.